good is AI perceiving people's emotions?
The technology is getting better and better in terms of picking up on the cues and reading them mostly accurately.
So today we have Anita Woolley, who's here from Carnegie Mellon's Tepper School of Business. Anita was named one of the most influential organizational psychologists.
Anita is a teacher at the highest degree of teacherhood. She studied at Harvard University and got her doctorate there in education.
We also have papers published in Science, National Academy of Sciences, Academy of Management Review, Organizational Science. I mean, the list could just go on and on.
How about the metaverse? So, because I know that you're also getting into the metaverse too. So where do you think future of the teams within the metaverse?
Well, I think it's really exciting. I mean, clearly there's some kind of kooky stuff going on, but
speaking about AI, have you heard about Elon Musk, and then I think the godfather of AI too, Jeffrey Hinton? They both are saying that AI should be halted until there's more regulation and clarity. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
well, I mean, I think the genie is out of the bottle. So I completely sympathize with kind of what they're trying to do. But I think that I don't know that it's ever going to be centrally regulated. I think it's really going to have to be more of a cultural, community, social norms kind of approach, because how do you stop everybody from completely creating new technology, right? I mean, there's demand for it. I think the market will probably speak regardless of what we might try to do to keep it from happening.
Right. Yeah. And I know that also, there's kind of a lot of competition, not only between organizations here in the US, but also in China. So it's almost like people are saying it's like an arms race, which society can come up with better AI technology faster. So,
Right.
Yeah, you're definitely spot on with the genie is out of the bottle. And at this point, it's like, what can you do really?
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think, each organization needs to define its standards, its norms, its, operating principles, right? In terms of its contract with its employees and its customers and other stakeholders, and how it's going to make use of these technologies, hopefully to enhance the quality of life and what they deliver, for everybody involved, for all the stakeholders.
Absolutely. So, just to kind of piggyback on that, I know some of your research is in using AI to enhance team performance. So can you just kind of share a little bit about some of the findings that you've made in those research studies so far?
Sure. And I mean, we're just at the beginning. I feel like we're just scratching the surface, but, just, I guess, to give a little context, there's a lot, of course, of technology, AI based and otherwise now, that is really helping people do things either more efficiently or more effectively or both. So we often think of these as production technologies. So now we have ChatGPT. If I want to write a letter, I can put some stuff into there and it spits out whatever, right? Or a paper or whatever. But what we haven't explored as much, but where I think me and my collaborators think there's a lot of opportunity is in coordination technology. How can we actually use AI technology to make it easier to collaborate with other people, to coordinate our inputs, to produce things that we can't produce on our own, but we can produce by drawing on, the expertise of other people. And so in our work on collective intelligence, we've been working for over a decade now, really getting into what are the processes that characterize groups that are really effective, that are really collectively intelligent. How is it that they pool their knowledge? How is it that they prioritize and, kind of build on each other's capacity to be able to accomplish more? And then how could we incorporate AI-based tools into collaboration platforms in a way that would help teams do that even more effectively, maybe with larger groups that are even more distributed, et cetera. So, even we know now even setting the time for a meeting can be a challenge, right? Because of all of the different coordination issues, time zones, et cetera. What if those things became trivial, or maybe we could even do more without needing to get together at the same time, and could do more things asynchronously. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to come when we figure out how to solve the problems of coordination using the technologies that are being developed.
So what are some of like the technologies or tools that you've seen, and maybe some examples that really help the collaboration between team members?
So some of the things we've done, and again, this is kind of the beginning of our work looking at this, have really looked at, okay, how can we use technology to prompt teams to pay attention to some things that might be hindering them that they could do more effectively? So one of the areas is using knowledge and skill. I don't know if you've been in a team before where you're in a meeting, you're working on a problem, and you know that some people know a lot about the problem, but they're not the ones doing all the talking, or they're not the ones taking the lead, but nobody's really saying anything about the fact that like the way we're doing this doesn't make any sense, or maybe we don't even know what we're trying to do. And so what we've experimented with are some tools that sort of in the background know who knows what, or are kind of keeping track of how different people are contributing, and might prompt the group when it seems like things are not really aligned, right? Sort of say, hey, let's hold up a minute. What is it we're trying to do here? Or, Anita's trying to edit the podcast, but, maybe she's not the best one. Maybe this should be Fong's role, right? Because this is something he has expertise in. And so just kind of helping facilitate the process where maybe social norms or people's inhibitions kind of trip us up. Okay, so that's just one example. There could be, I think, a lot of opportunities that we're thinking about where, okay, maybe there's a large group of people that you need to get input from on some situation, but again, it's impossible to set up a meeting. How could we gather that input asynchronously in a way that is really engaging and draws together the inputs and facilitates the process, so that we get everybody's opinion, we get their feedback, we get their buy-in, we get their commitment to the decision process without being bound up by who can be at the meeting, or not being able to move forward because we can't pull together a meeting. So it's another area that I think there's a lot of opportunity for.
Wow, that's really interesting. So do you think, I think one of your areas of research is teams having a technology aversion, some teams having a technology aversion, especially as a facilitating sort of AI. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, in fact, that's something that we kind of got into in many ways by accident, because what we have discovered, I think, again and again, is that it's a lot easier to mess up a team with technology than it is to help it. And so just as people don't necessarily like AI to come in and take over their job at work, a lot of times humans feel like, they are pretty good at making social judgments. And so if this, bot is showing up and trying to tell them how to manage relationships or how to behave, they don't necessarily like that. So we have had experiments where we thought, oh, well, here's a helpful intervention. One example was something that a lot of groups might worry about, especially student groups might worry about, is whether everybody is doing their share of the work. And so if you are working together online, you can't necessarily see what everybody's doing. And so everybody might be afraid, well, gee, is everybody pulling their weight? So we built a little feedback, real-time feedback sort of display that showed all the team members, like how much everybody was contributing, with the idea that maybe if somebody wasn't contributing as much, well, then they would be sort of like pressured into contributing more, and that might improve the group's work. Well, what we found in this one study is that it totally backfired, because the person who was not contributing as much felt I don't know, like mad, shamed, embarrassed, so they withdrew. But so did the people who were doing all the work, because they were mad that nobody else was doing the work, and pretty much the group imploded, right? And so that's just a very simple, low level kind of technological intervention, but definitely backfired. There are, other examples, I think, from us and from others. Definitely, again, whenever you're trying to give people advice about how to interact with other people, and the advice is coming not from a person, you can get some pretty big reactions.
Wow, that is interesting. So we know that AI tools can be really helpful, be great facilitators. So how do you get buy-in? Let's say for that person that was slacking, right? How do you get that person to buy in that the AI is actually a good tool that will help the group overall?
Well, I think in that setting, because hindsight's always 2020, we've thought, if we go back and do that experiment, maybe giving that feedback privately to the person, more like a coach. This is your friend. This is your little mentor, kind of like, hey, you're doing pretty well, but you could, maybe amp it up a little bit, because look, your other team members are kind of working a little harder and they're really relying on you, that kind of thing, versus like the public shaming approach. So that might be one way to kind of make it more of a personal coach versus a public sort of performance evaluation.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of when I was a sales leader in college. I had a team of, salespeople that I, led. And whenever I learned that whenever you have feedback on ways that someone can improve, you give it in private. And whenever you have praise, you give it in public in front of everybody, right? So, so it's like tailoring that AI is the same.
Yeah, no, and it totally makes sense. And I guess it's just a matter also of, I've observed a lot of coaches over time also, because I've studied teamwork for quite a while. And I've always been intrigued by coaches, especially coaches who are really good. And I think probably coaches often figure out quickly what motivates people. And there are some people who really aren't going to listen to you unless the message is loud and maybe even public. But for the most part, I'd agree with what you're saying, that the general conventional wisdom works for most, which is that, constructive criticism or developmental feedback is better done privately.
So in your experience, how good is AI with perceiving people's emotions, and, like facial expressions, body language, within a group?
So I think the technology is getting better and better in terms of picking up on the cues and reading them mostly accurately. The part that I think is still going to be a while in coming will be the context, right? Like, what does it mean? It might pick up on the fact that I seem angry, but, drawing inferences about what that could be related to or what to do about it, I think is a higher level of reasoning that doesn't, really, I haven't seen good examples of yet. And so I think for that reason, at the moment, probably the best opportunities are for tools that could help pick up those cues and provide them as a dashboard or an input to a human decision maker, so that, it could be that I'm giving a presentation, but the group is too big, or I can't see everybody, or whatever, the situation might be. But I could have, this input saying, what, people seem to be kind of checking out, they're doing other things, or, they're asleep, or whatever it might be, that then I can take in and incorporate and use my judgment about. That I think that is the biggest opportunity for us at the moment.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. I could definitely see it just identifying, things such as if someone is mad, like you said, that's good feedback for the facilitator or the leader of the group to then get that information and maybe ask that person, hey, it seems like you're mad and frustrated. Is there something that you're frustrated about? And maybe we can help you out, make you feel happy again. So something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Or it could be that, the leader gets that input, but already kind of knows some contextual information and knows what that's probably about and whether it's a problem or not.
Right. Absolutely. Wow. That's really, really, really interesting. So, how about the metaverse? So, because I know that you're also getting into the metaverse too. So, where do you think the future will be? The future of the like teams within the metaverse, And I think one of the things I heard what was it? Mark Zuckerberg. He was on a podcast with Joe Rogan, and he started sharing some of the things that they're working on, and where you can be in these suits, right? And you could there's a more sense of connectivity. If you're like, let's say, meeting with a team, you
Right.
could see people's facial expressions better. You can see their body language. So yeah, I think it's really unique and interesting. But what do you think the future of, teams and the metaverse is going to look like?
Well, I think it's really exciting. I mean, clearly there's some kind of kooky stuff going on, but I think that, because right now, one of the ongoing debates is sort of like return to office versus remote work and what's the policy and et cetera, and all these different points of view about whether or not teams can collaborate remotely. My point of view is that teams can absolutely collaborate just as well remotely, but they have to adopt the right practices. And I think some of the technology that you're referring to and that is being developed, very rapidly, is going to help that, right? So instead of sitting here at my computer and trying to maintain good posture and stay close to my microphone so that you can hear me and see me, with these technologies, I can just be sitting wherever, and I can experience you as sitting near me, or we could move around in space, like as if we're in an office building, and I could go see you in your office and see if you're busy and drop in on you if you're not, or, all of the things that I think people feel like are important parts of the experience of being in a shared environment together could be duplicated to the degree that they're helpful, for facilitating coordination and collaboration. And so I think it's exciting, and the reason why I'm excited about the role it can play in facilitating, remote work continuing is just because of the opportunities it gives to other, to people and to organizations, right? To be able to access talent and for individuals to access job opportunities, but live where they want to live.
I could definitely see that, like it could make things a lot more efficient as far as, and actually improve, just instead of, maybe instead of just us doing a Zoom podcast, right? We could do it through the metaverse where we're sitting in front of each other and it feels like it's real, but it's not. And we can be far away. You're in Pennsylvania, I'm here in California. So I think that's great. Do you see any downsides of using the metaverse for, teams and the workplace?
Well, I mean, I think with any technology like that, it could be abused in certain ways, certainly. You wouldn't want it to completely take the place of any other sort of interaction. You wouldn't want people to be socially isolated in ways that would deprive, their social well-being, their mental health. You also, again, hear about some of the darker sides of what people are trying to do, with these technologies. And so certainly you wouldn't want people to be more exposed to some sort of abuse, because the metaverse is wide open and it's the Wild West kind of thing. But I think that, I do see a lot of the benefits that we started to see a little bit in the pandemic when organizations were forced into, having everybody go remote. We saw some benefits for, the climate. We saw benefits for reducing traffic congestion, et cetera. And I think that, those things could be revived and expanded if we had better technologies that, enable people to meet without having to physically go to the same location. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So that being said, I saw what was it? Oh, is it a talk that you gave at the World Economic Forum. Wow, congratulations. That's awesome.
Yeah, that
A
was
few
fun.
years ago. And then you talked about how 9/11 could have been prevented if the teams, the intelligence community worked together more
Mhm.
cohesively. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that was pretty early on in my career. My advisor for my postdoc
Mhm.
uh, was an advisor to the director of the CIA at the time when 9/11
Mm.
happened. And so we were actually called in to do some research on what the issues were. And there, I think, technology, as we've been discussing, could be part of the solution, but there are also have been in the past, and I think to some degree remain, some social barriers as well, right? So different agencies, different classes of professionals who, have more mental barriers around, who is worth including in conversations, who has useful information, whom they should share information with. We certainly have a whole very complex system of classifying information, which also creates additional barriers in many cases for some of these collaborations because of the need to restrict access to sources and methods, right, to
Mhm.
protect those who are gathering that information, but it can definitely impede the coordination needed to prevent stuff from happening. So it's a tricky problem in terms of figuring out
Mhm.
what level of access and how freely to share information. And technology both creates complications with that as well as potentially helps. But I think that perhaps, as we do figure out how to thread that needle of, having this technology that gives us access to everybody in the world, together with the information security layers that are necessary for some sorts of collaboration to happen, maybe that could actually enhance collaboration even in those environments where there are these institutional barriers for good reason. If we didn't have to worry about people overseeing or overhearing and seeing or getting access to data they shouldn't, that might make it easier for people to then talk about the things they can talk about. Right now, though, I know that the professionals who do that work go to great pains to protect the information, and it makes it harder to collaborate sometimes.
Mhm. So what is the solution? Is it to create a database like you're saying where information is, more easily accessed? Is it, being more open between each other and having more trust? What is the solution once it comes to like really sensitive agencies like that?
I think the opinions on what to do about it cover the gamut. When I was working in that setting during my postdoc, at times I did think to myself, it feels like the bad guys have all the information they want. It's only us that that we don't have the information.
Mm.
So, and I have heard people, express the opinion, maybe we should just get rid of all of the classification system, right?
Mhm.
Because of all of the leaks and all of the ways that the information gets out anyway, and all the ways that it impedes us from doing what we need to do. I don't know if that's really, really the realistic answer, just because, who would ever want to work in some of the roles that they do now if they weren't protected,
Mm.
right? Because, people's lives are at stake with some of these information leaks. And if their identities revealed to folks who would want to hurt them if they knew what their role really was. And so we
Mhm.
wouldn't want to do that. If we had, just the perfect, information security system that could really protect the critically important information, that would be ideal.
Mhm.
But we know that there's always smart people on both sides of the issue, right? The
Mhm.
smart people trying to undermine what the smart people came up with. So it's hard to imagine how we're ever going to get away from that. I mean, I didn't give you a pat answer to the question you asked me, because I don't think there is one. But hopefully, I think maybe I'll say this. I think that there are a lot of these barriers that are put up that maybe are not necessary. Perhaps we've expanded them more than we need to. And if there was a way to sort of trim them back down to the essential to enable more collaboration. And this is, I mean, we're talking about the intelligence community and the government now, but you could even say that for organizations. I mean, I've worked with organizations where they might have one division working on products that they think are going to be, just the next, gangbuster. And they won't tell other people in the organization about it, right? You might have people working in parallel on the same problems and they don't even know it. And I think that the fundamental issues are kind of the same across those two settings, where people are estimating the cost of information getting out to be very, very high and underestimating the cost of the ways that they're impeding coordination and collaboration as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, there's typically, I'm sure there's been distrust between the sides in the future where, one side kind of used that information in a way that maybe hurt the other side. And so what if, maybe the two leaders come together and hash things out and try to figure out what's best, because at the end of the day, the goals are aligned, which is protect people in the society. And so, understanding that, I think could help, just communicating.
Yeah. And again, just kind of being aware of the cost of these different decisions. We know that building trust, I mean, it can take forever to build trust with somebody, and it can take like a moment to lose it all. There's kind of this asymmetry, right? And I think that's definitely true, even when we're talking about all this information security stuff, but just recognizing that, when you're dealing with a whole organization, there are going to be individuals and, certain, small events that happen that erode trust, and whether or not we let that tear the whole thing down, I think is an important question for leaders to be very cognizant of.
Absolutely. So if you were to and this is just out of curiosity, if you were to create let's say the most ideal team, the most perfect team, what would that look like? Where would you start? Tell me your thought process of how you would go about creating a high performing team. And let's just say for business.
Okay. Well, I mean, so I think I would think hard about the qualities of the individuals to start with, right? So, of course, you want to bring together people who have complementary expertise. So depending on what I'm trying to do, figure out what's the knowledge base I need and find those people. But on top of that, something I focused a lot on in my research is the importance of collaboration skills. And so I would want to also make sure that they were people who were interested in being a good collaborator and, seem to have at least a basic capability to communicate well. And I think that I would probably emphasize a lot the motivation above all else, right? That, even if, whatever, we all mess up, forget to tell people something or make an assumption, but as long as people are open to, learning how to collaborate better and are trying to, I think that's the most important thing. And so I would, try to pull together this, this dream team that has this combination of skills. And then I think, having the ability to collaborate, both remotely and sometimes, face to face is important. So I don't think I would focus on whether or not they were, right near me. And in fact, I would want to, work with people who are open to collaborating asynchronously and remotely, just because I think probably, if it's this, smart, creative group of people, they're going to have a variety of things they're doing. And so do I, and so some of it will involve our collaboration and some of it will involve other things. And that will actually probably enrich our collaboration because we'll have broader networks and other ideas that we can bring into the work that we're doing together. So I guess, in sort of general terms, that's kind of, where I would start. Yeah. And then, if we can get some of these, metaverse suits or whatever, like all the better.
Right.
But yeah, I think, and in fact, I think I probably do work with a team not unlike the one I'm describing. I'm really lucky. I have a variety of different collaborations I do with people who are pretty good at it.
Okay. So, some of the things you mentioned there is number one, expertise. Number two, having someone that's a collaborator, people with great collaboration skills, can communicate. Number three, having the right motivations. And then number four, being able to bring in creative people, and then it doesn't matter where they're physically at. It could be hybrid. So you mentioned collaborative skills. How do you identify, like if someone's interviewing someone and they're like, yeah, I have great collaboration skills. Like, how do you know that they have great collaboration skills? What are some signs or some maybe questions that you could ask?
Yeah, I think it's easier to pick up on than people may realize, especially once you kind of get used to, if that's a focus that you have. There are certainly tests, and we use tests in our research, but and the thing that we test is this thing, this ability, social perceptiveness. So social perceptiveness is a skill that is part of the broader category of social intelligence, and it relates to the ability to pick up on subtle cues and draw inferences about what others are thinking or feeling, or even anticipate how they might respond to something that you're about to say, for example. And so people who are socially perceptive, when you're interacting with them, if you're attuned to it, you will notice that. Like they will notice that, oh, you seem uncomfortable. Oh, I guess the air conditioner, is a little cold. Let me turn it down. Or you're squinting. Let me close the shade because of the light. That, they're picking up on cues that signal to them what the other person is experiencing in ways, that are relevant to how they're interacting with each other. They might also anticipate something you need to know. This is really helpful in collaboration, especially remote collaboration, because they're going to figure out, oh, you know what, like, so-and-so wasn't part of that conversation. Let me let him know that we talked about this thing, and now this other thing is going to change, or whatever the situation might be. So that, I think, is a key one. And there are other pieces to social intelligence around then managing social interactions that use that information effectively, or managing, how you express, different ideas or feelings. But they tend to be correlated with each other. So like people who are good at picking up on and drawing inferences on cues also tend to be good at the other things. And so you can fairly readily pick up on these things through even a set of interactions when, say, you're interviewing somebody for a position, and say you're emailing back and forth, and then maybe there's another call to set something up, and then there's a meeting. Usually through that set of interactions, some things would have happened where somebody would have been a little bit like not paying attention, or they would have been attentive to things that would, things that they could do that will make the interaction go more smoothly based on cues that they're getting from the other person.
I see. And then in order to recognize those cues, you probably need to be, being able to pick up on things too, right? To be perceptive of those things.
Right. Yeah. So you yourself. Yeah. And I suppose that this all assumes that you are. Although I would say that if I really wanted to figure that out about somebody, I could probably set up a situation where it's like, okay, if this person is socially perceptive, they will probably respond, in a certain way. And if they're not, then they won't.
Right.
Like if I'm in the middle of a meeting and my phone rings, and I pick it up and I start talking, and it's clear that it's a personal conversation.
Mhm.
If you're sitting there with me, what do you do?
Right.
And
Mhm.
probably you say, oh, let me step out if you need a minute, or, whatever, depending on, the context, if there's an easy way to do that, or maybe, if you can't get out of earshot, well, you'll get busy with your phone and not be paying attention to whatever they're talking about.
Mhm.
Depends on the situation, but picking up on that and the fact that you should change what you're doing is like the key thing.
Mhm. Yeah. I'm reading this book called Buy Back Your Time. And one of the things he talks about is, and he learned this from someone else, is before he hires someone, he says, or he it's like working with someone before you actually work with them. So
Mhm.
he gives them sort of like a test case, or a test task where they do it over a certain amount of time, and then based off of and he purposely makes it vague, right? So like if he's hiring for an administrative assistant,
Mhm.
he will give them a task similar to like send Chris a gift. He's a client of ours, and then keep it at that. And
Mhm.
so if like the administrative assistant starts asking him a bunch of questions on what to do, then he knows that's probably not the best fit, because he wants someone that can think for themselves, that is more
Mhm.
critical, like a critical thinker that
Mhm.
could think on their feet, right? And so it seems like giving someone a task or a test task could really help, identify if they're a collaborator or not.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, I think a lot of these things, if you have the right, task, like
Mhm.
in the example you gave, it'll give you the input you need to get a sense of that.
Right.
And I think actually what I like about your example too, it's something that is kind of part of my research, but not a central theme, but this idea that there are actually really good and valid ways to assess skills in people, that a lot of hiring processes are done really badly and don't make use of
Mm,
ideas like the one you were just describing. And instead,
mm,
they want to know, like, oh, what school did you go to, or what was your
mhm,
last position, and all kinds of things that are very noisy signals about, what your capabilities really are. And they also
mhm,
limit opportunities for people who don't have those things on their resume, right? So
mhm.
I'm a big advocate of figuring out what qualities you need your collaborators to have, or your employees, and finding really, insightful and valid ways to assess them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's amazing how I personally believe the hiring process is a little outdated. It's
Mm,
especially after hearing some of the things that he says, and I've heard it in the past too, but he just kind of gave some real life scenarios that he did. Like for example, he was hiring, I think, a chief marketing officer, and the person sounded really great in the interview, said the right things, really liked him, and then they had him do a test task to present a plan on how to get marketing around to his team. And so they're all sitting there, and he presented it really well, and then they started giving him some feedback, and he seemed really resistant to the feedback, like he was at some points just being aggressive back to his team. So he's like, hey, that you got to work well with others.
yeah.
And so just something like that, just a task could save so much time on the back end, being able to, you know, um, weed out the people in the beginning versus spending all this
Hmm.
time training them.
Hmm. Yeah,
Hmm.
and it's hugely expensive. I mean,
Hmm.
to make, many hiring mistakes. I mean, you can't necessarily figure everything out in advance, but you can figure out the big things, right?
Hmm.
And so collaborative skill is increasingly one of those things, I think, in more and more jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. So, talking about collaboration and, someone that's very perceptive and can pick up on cues. You mentioned, I think, in your research that most of them are women, right? And so a team with more women tend to do well or better, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's something early on in our research, the correlation between the proportion of women and collective intelligence was something that turned up. And it was not something we were initially really looking to examine. It wasn't a hypothesis we had. And in fact, the first study when that showed up, I was a graduate student who noticed it in the data. And I was like, oh, that's might be a spurious correlation. Like, I don't think we should make a big deal of that. But then it would show up again and again. And digging into it is where we actually then got into this role of social perceptiveness, because it turns out, on average, that women tend to score higher on tests of that type of skill than men. And the reasons for that are kind of multifaceted. There's definitely a biological component where there's some studies showing a correlation between testosterone, both like exposure to prenatal testosterone, as well as even, situationally when you prime aggression by creating competition or threat, you tend to suppress people's ability to pick up on, lots of cues in their environment. And so, so there's this biological component for, women having on average less testosterone. So that's one piece, but there's definitely a social learning aspect to it as well, in terms of the roles that girls and women tend to play, in most societies, and the fact that they're expected to kind of be more attentive to others' needs. And so then they learn and are reinforced for doing that. So the fact that this shows up in our data is sort of, reflecting the culture, and it turns out that teamwork benefits from this as well. But all that said, I know lots of men who are great collaborators. And as I was saying earlier, I think motivation plays a huge role in it. So I think primarily if people are motivated and really think that's important, they're likely to do it well. And women, I think, historically anyway, have placed more importance on it. So that's why that tends to show up in our studies.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, that, women biologically probably are more inclined to be socially perceptive, and then socially as well. And then I'm sure, like, being able to identify the right mate, because if they're going to spend their life with someone, and they want to make sure that that person is the right fit to help raise the child and to provide for the family. So maybe that has a little bit to do with it too.
Although on that score, I mean, men also need to be careful, like, about the mate that they would choose.
Right.
So, I mean, certainly that could play a role, but in addition, if you're thinking about evolutionary sorts of explanations, the well-being of the children as well as the older members of the family would be in part dependent on having, a wife and a mother and a daughter who are attentive, to the needs of these others who might need more care. And so there'd be an advantage to the family to have women who are better at picking up on these cues, especially when people, especially like small children, for example, can't express them clearly themselves.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So have you found, like, is the makeup of the team the same across different sort of settings? Like, for example, if you're trying to build, let's say, I think one of your studies is on, like, building studying a high performing video game team versus, like, let's say you're building a team for the military, or you're building a team for business. Do they differ across different settings like that?
Well, so we have studied collective intelligence across those settings, as it sounds like you've done a lot of homework in looking at all these papers. And we do find that the basic components are very similar. I mean, clearly the content of the expertise of the members is going to be different in those different settings. But assuming, okay, you have a certain content expertise that you need, and you have that covered across the different members, the other components are pretty similar. in terms of, these ability to collaborate, as we've talked about. Another one that we tend to see in a lot of our studies is cognitive style diversity. So in addition to somebody's expertise, we all tend to have a primary cognitive style, or a way that we tend to organize information in our own mind, both in terms of how we take it in and also how we express it. Some people are much more holistic and visualizers. They think in terms of images. Others are more linear in terms of thinking analytically and breaking things down into parts. And so having both of those kinds of cognitive styles in a team is beneficial, because there are different tasks, different parts of tasks, different phases of work that benefit from one approach versus the other. So that's another input that seems to be true across different domains, that having diversity can be beneficial.
Yeah, I think that's great, because I noticed that in my business, I'm more of like the big picture sort of person, I don't like details. I don't like, all those things. So, when I'm hiring, I look for someone that's very detail oriented, that can pick up the things that I left off. And then I like to start things, come up with the ideas, and then I don't fully complete it. And so having someone that can take it towards the end could really benefit, as far as the team goes.
That I think that's absolutely right. And when I've worked with organizations so these cognitive styles tend to be aligned with different occupational areas. So for example, the kind of analytical linear thinking is common in, say, engineering. Whereas the holistic big picture thinking is maybe more common in design and, more creative sorts of, work domains. And so, but the two need each other, right? Because what the analytical thinkers find is that, they might be following some procedures, but they're not really producing things that are creative or new, or they're not pushing boundaries. And then, as you articulated, and I think it's insightful, thinking about these like big ideas requires somebody who then will think through the details to execute. And so I think both are necessary. And sometimes both can get really, exasperated with the other, because, it can be, it's always annoying when people are, prioritizing something you don't think is as important. But if you recognize the importance, you can respect each other and value what you each bring.
So is there like a sort of like a team with the perfect sort of set of makeup of personality types? So like, let's say Myers-Briggs, for example, right? Like maybe is it important to have someone that's like an INFJ and then like ENTP, and then like, have you found personality types having a role in high performing teams, like making sure the team has a different types of people and that the types get along with each other?
So yes, I would say, like, analytically, we could probably, document you want, a mix of, introverts and extroverts. You want a mix of people with different levels of agreeableness, but you probably want, mostly people who are similar in conscientiousness and et cetera. I mean, down the line, but almost no team is going to be perfect, especially if it's a reasonable size, which most people find, if they're really interacting closely with, some collaborators, then you really want like less than 5 people within that size group. It's going to be very hard to have the perfect configuration of all of these things, right? Just mathematically. And so what it really means is you want to get the big things in place. So, and for me, that would be, the right expertise, the social collaboration skills, and cognitive style diversity. And the rest of it, you want to, really get the team to think about, okay, what are our strengths? In what ways is our composition ideal, and which ways is it not ideal? And what do we have to be aware of, in knowing how it's not ideal? For example, if we're all extroverts, chances are we're going to struggle for who's in charge. If it's not already clear who's in charge, we're going to all struggle to try to be in charge. But if we're aware of that, maybe we can find ways to mitigate that. Maybe we can be in charge of different things, or we can rotate who's in charge, at different points in time, or whatever, the situation might be. And so a lot of times when I'm teaching my courses, that's what I try to get the teams in my courses to do, is like recognize no team's perfect. You're going to have some strengths, and you're going to have some areas you got to be aware of, some risks or some difficulties, and have some strategies in mind for how to deal with it.
Interesting. So you said 5 is the number, like a 5 is ideal for.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a generalization, but there have been a number of studies that have looked at, what's the ideal team size, and looking at it from the perspective of, where do you provide opportunities for everybody to make a meaningful contribution versus having, the 80-20 rule, where a couple people are doing everything and a bunch of people are doing not much. When you look at people's level of satisfaction, as well as just the productivity, how many people do you have on the team and what have you produced? The converging evidence points to, 5 plus or minus 2, which actually also is the size of most people's working memory, which is probably not a total coincidence, but really actually probably 5 or less is in reality what most people find most satisfying. The thing though, getting back to our earlier technology conversations, when we look at some studies where collaboration is technologically mediated, especially if the tools are good, what we see is that we might be able to expand that number, right? That while if we're having a meeting and there's, the meeting is a certain length, which means there's only a certain amount of airtime. If you have a certain number of people above that number, not everybody's going to get to talk, right? So that right there is some sort of a limitation. But if we're really good at collaborating asynchronously and making our contributions in other ways, well, then you don't have that limitation. Or if, these like dream coordination technologies that I was talking about earlier, came online, it could be that we would see an expansion of the size groups that can really be productive. But given our old evolutionary brains and, current state of technology, the rule of thumb has been, 5 or less for most things.
Right. So I'm just thinking about not to get too political, but our, Congress, House of Representatives, where there's a ton of people, and so, and everybody's technically on the same team, which is how can we better America and our citizens? Or at least they should be thinking that way. So that being said, if you were, and it's so divided, I think everybody can agree it's so divided. So if you were, let's say you came in, Anita, and everybody's like, all right, Anita, can you help us really work better together? Like, what would you do? Would you kind of put people in groups of 5 and just kind of like work together from both, ends and spectrums in one group? And what would you do?
Well, I think in reality, when things do get done, that is how they get done, right? I mean, they have these committee meetings, but in reality, it's like a couple of people who behind the scenes get together and really, broker what the agreement is going to be. And then it's rolled out. And I think it's important to also be clear that a lot of times Congress, in organizations, a lot of other contexts, you have large groups, in part because you kind of need buy-in. You need people to, have had a say, to sort of get to approve or disapprove of something, and so sometimes in those settings, there's a role for those groups, but it's not really to really collaborate and hash things out. By the way, definitely lots of data to show the role of women in helping that to happen, even in the current Congress. So actually where I would start is to elect more women.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I think that could definitely help. Sure.
It couldn't hurt anyway,
Right,
or I don't know. I
couldn't
mean,
hurt.
maybe maybe famous last words, but or just that's a whole other hour-long conversation, right? Like incentives matter. And so I think one of the issues right now is that they are not incentivized to collaborate or to be cooperative. So
definitely
that's on all of us.
Absolutely. So just to wrap up, I know you've done so much research, and there's probably been so many key takeaways, but if you had to sum it up, like what advice would you give businesses and teams that, if they understood this, it would have a tremendous positive impact in the world?
Well, I think actually a lot of what we've been talking about points back to what it would be, which is that, even as we were talking about hiring, there's a tendency to focus on individuals' accomplishments and how great they are. But I think increasingly, it's hard to think of many organizations where people don't need to be able to collaborate. And so to really focus on that, in bringing people into the organization. And then when you have a team that works well together, that is a huge asset. And there's so many organizations that, will mix and match teams or pull, people from one to the other and not really allow them to, develop that capability of working together and to leverage that capability, for a longer period of time. If anything, people, in part because of technology and how easy it is to communicate, people are put on too many projects. I mean, everybody I talk to talks about that. And so they don't get the chance to focus enough or really develop that teamwork. And I think many organizations are shooting themselves in the foot because they're not clear enough about what are their priorities, where do they want people to focus, and helping them to really develop that collective intelligence so that they can deliver. So that would be my message, I guess.
Awesome. Great. Thank you so much for being on, Anita. I can't believe it's already been an hour. Time flies.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks. Thanks for having me. This is great.
Yeah, absolutely. Where can people find you?
So AnitaWoolley.com is my website, or I'm at Carnegie Mellon, CI Lab at Carnegie Mellon.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, everybody, for listening or watching. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.